The puppy was not crying to be saved. It was guarding something the storm had tried to bury. By the time Officer Ethan Walker turned his cruiser onto County Road 17, the rain had washed the whole town of Ashford Hollow into a blur of blacktop. Silver puddles and trembling porch lights. It was 1:47 inches the morning, the hour when even the old brick storefronts seemed to hold their breath. And the only sound came from the steady slap of wipers and the low murmur of dispatch fading in and out through the radio. Ethan was 42, broad-shouldered, pale-skinned, and quiet in the way men become quiet after carrying too much for too long. Before the badge on his chest, there had been another uniform, desert dust in his lungs, a military watch on his wrist, and a name from the past he almost never said out loud. He had spent years learning how to notice small things: a light left on in an empty house, tire marks near a ditch, a dog barking where no dog should be. That night, it was the sound from the storm drain beside the abandoned St. Elian rail yard that made him touch the brake. It was not a full bark, not even a whine, just a thin, broken sound rising beneath the rain, small enough to miss and sad enough to haunt a man if he kept driving. Ethan pulled over near the rusted chain-link fence, stepped into ankle-deep water, and lifted his flashlight against the dark. The old rail yard crouched beyond the fence like a forgotten animal, its loading docks sagging, its windows boarded, its tracks disappearing under weeds and mud. The town council had voted to tear it down by the end of the month. Most folks said, "Good riddance." Ethan had never liked the place, though he could not have explained why. He knelt beside the drain, rain running from the brim of his hat, and aimed the beam through the iron grate. Two amber eyes looked back at him. The puppy was wedged on a narrow ledge above the rushing water, soaked through, its silver-gray fur clinging to a body no bigger than a football. But it did not scramble toward the light. It did not panic. Instead, with one shaking paw, it pushed something across the concrete lip toward Ethan, inch by inch, as if it had been waiting for the right hands to find it. Ethan reached through the grate and closed his fingers around the object. It was cold, heavy, and eaten by rust. But beneath the mud, he could still make out the shape: an old service badge, the kind worn long before his time. For a moment, the rain seemed to soften around him. The puppy stared past Ethan, toward the rail yard gates, ears trembling, eyes fixed on the dark loading house beyond the tracks. Then it gave 3 tiny barks, sharp and deliberate, like a signal remembered from somewhere older than fear. Ethan felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. He had rescued lost dogs before. Cats from culverts, raccoons from trash bins, even a fawn tangled in garden netting behind a church. But he had never found a puppy guarding a badge in a storm drain at 2 a.m. And he had never seen an animal look at an abandoned building as if it knew exactly what was sleeping inside. "Yassi, little one," he murmured, though his own voice sounded strange in the rain. He pried the grate loose with the crowbar from his trunk, moving slowly, careful not to frighten the pup or let the water rise around it. When he finally lifted the small animal into his arms, it pressed its wet head against the old military watch on his wrist and went still, not relaxed, not safe, listening. Ethan wrapped it in the emergency blanket from his cruiser and carried it to the passenger seat, where the puppy sat upright, despite its trembling legs, nose pointed toward the rail yard. Refusing to look away, the badge lay in Ethan's palm, streaked with mud, its engraved numbers barely visible under the dashlight. Somewhere behind the boarded warehouses, a loose sheet of metal tapped in the wind, slow and hollow, almost like someone knocking from the other side of a wall. Ethan told himself it was only the storm. He told himself many things that night. But as he started the cruiser and turned toward Dr. Hannah Reed's veterinary clinic 3 miles outside town, the puppy raised its head and gave one final soft bark toward the darkness. And Ethan understood, without wanting to, that this was not the end of a rescue. It was the beginning of something that had waited years to be found. The road to Dr. Hannah Reed's clinic ran east through 3 miles of pine woods, low pasture land, and telephone poles that leaned like tired old men against the weather. Ethan drove slower than usual. Not because the rain was blinding, though it was, but because the puppy beside him seemed to be listening to the world in a way Ethan had not seen since his army years. The little dog sat wrapped in the silver emergency blanket, its paws tucked beneath its chest, its amber eyes reflecting every passing streetlight. It should have been exhausted. It should have curled into the warmth and slept. Instead, it watched the dark tree line through the passenger window, ears twitching at sounds buried beneath the engine, beneath the tires hissing over wet pavement, beneath the steady breath of the storm. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other near the old badge on the console. Mud still clung to its edges, and in the glow of the dashboard, he could see faint grooves where numbers had once been engraved with care. He had not cleaned it yet. Something about wiping away the dirt felt almost disrespectful, as if the storm had placed it in his palm exactly as it wanted it found. The puppy lowered its nose and sniffed the badge once, then turned its head away from it, back toward the road behind them. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything, even when he wished he did not. Years earlier, before Ashford Hollow, before the county uniform, before the quiet house on Maple Ridge Road, Ethan had worn desert boots and slept with one ear open. He had believed in preparation, training, good men, and clean orders. He had believed that if a person stayed alert enough, he could keep the worst things from happening. Time had taught him differently. It had taken names from his life and left him with habits, instead checking locks twice, parking where he could see the exit, waking before dawn with his heart steady but his hands cold. The watch on his wrist had belonged to his closest friend, Daniel Price, a man who used to say that signs were just God whispering through ordinary things. Ethan had laughed at that back then. He had not laughed in years. The puppy shifted suddenly and pressed its wet nose against the watch crystal. Ethan glanced down. The cracked face of the watch caught a flash of lightning. And for one brief second, the small dog's reflection appeared over the hands, both of them trembling in the same pale light. "You like that?" "Huh?" Ethan said softly. The puppy did not wag its tail. It simply leaned closer, as if the old watch carried a scent it recognized. Ethan felt a strange tightness under his ribs and looked back to the road. "All right," he murmured. "Melo, that is what I am calling you, until somebody tells me different." At the sound of the name, the puppy blinked once, slow and solemn, as though accepting a duty rather than receiving a name. Ashford Hollow disappeared behind them. The last gas station faded into rain. Then the Baptist church. Then the white farmhouse with the broken weather vane. Beyond that, there was only the county road, dark pines, and the occasional mailbox shining under Ethan's headlights. The police radio crackled without warning, a low burst of static that filled the cruiser like dry leaves scraping across a floor. Milo lifted his head so fast, the blanket slid from his shoulders. His small body stiffened. The static faded. He relaxed. Then it came again. A thin thread of interference under the dispatcher's distant voice. And Milo gave one soft, urgent bark. Not fear. Recognition. Ethan reached for the volume knob but stopped halfway. The sound had a rhythm to it. 3 pulses. A pause. Then 3 more. He had heard bad wiring make strange music before. He had also learned, long ago, that the world sometimes repeated itself until somebody finally listened. It is just the radio, he said, though he no longer believed that completely. Milo turned toward him. Rainwater still beaded on his whiskers, and placed one paw on the edge of the console beside the badge. The gesture was so deliberate that Ethan forgot the road for half a breath. Then the clinic sign appeared ahead. Glowing soft blue through the downpour read veterinary care. Large and small animals. Emergency entrance in rear. The building sat alone beside an open field. Its porch light burning warm against the wet night. Ethan parked beneath the awning and killed the engine. For a moment, the sudden silence filled the cruiser like deep water. Milo looked toward the clinic door, then back toward the west, where the rail yard lay hidden beyond miles of rain. Ethan tucked the badge into an evidence pouch, gathered the puppy gently in both arms, and stepped out into the storm. Inside, beyond the glass door, a single light flicked on, and a woman's shadow moved quickly across the hall. Ethan had brought injured animals here before, but as doctor, Hannah Reed opened the emergency entrance and saw the puppy in his arms. Her calm expression changed before he said a word. She looked first at Milo, then at the mud-streaked pouch in Ethan's hand, and the warmth seemed to leave her face. The little dog lifted his head from the blanket and stared at her with those bright amber eyes. Hannah whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Where did you find him?" Ethan glanced back once at the rain-soaked road, feeling the night gather behind him. "Near St. Elian," he said. The name hung in the clinic doorway like cold breath. Hannah stepped aside at once, but her eyes did not leave the puppy. "Bring him in," she said, "and do not set that badge down anywhere public." Hannah Reed had the kind of clinic that never fully slept, even at 2 a.m. The place held a quiet warmth, the scent of clean cotton, cheddar soap, and old coffee resting beneath the sharper smell of antiseptic. A yellow lamp glowed over the examination table. Rain ticked against the windows in nervous little taps. Somewhere in the back, a rescued barn cat shifted in its cage and went still again. Ethan placed Milo on a folded towel, but the puppy did not collapse the way a frightened stray should have. He sat upright, small chest rising and falling, wet ears tilted toward the ceiling, as if listening to footsteps above them. Though there was only the roof and the storm, Hannah moved with practiced gentleness, warming her hands before touching him, speaking in the low, steady voice of someone who had calmed more fear than she could remember. "Yasi, sweetheart," she whispered, "nobody here is going to hurt you." Milo looked at her for a long second, then lowered his head enough to allow the exam. Ethan stood near the counter, rain dripping from his jacket onto the floor, one hand resting unconsciously over the evidence pouch in his coat pocket. He had known Hannah for 6 years. She had stitched paws torn on ice, treated patrol dogs with tired hips, and once driven 20 miles through a snowstorm to help a farmer deliver a calf before sunrise. Nothing rattled her easily. That was why the change in her face at the door stayed with him. She listened to Milo's heart, checked his gums, his pores, his ribs, the small pale scar along his left shoulder. He is cold and underfed, she said, but not neglected in the usual way. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Hannah lifted one of Milo's paws, turning it gently beneath the lamp. His nails were trimmed recently. Not perfectly, but carefully. His ears are clean. Someone kept him alive on purpose. The room seemed to tighten around those words. Milo's gaze drifted to the police radio clipped to Ethan's belt. It hissed once with static, and the puppy's whole body went rigid. Hannah noticed immediately. She reached across the counter and switched on a small diagnostic speaker she used for hearing tests. A low-frequency hum filled the room, soft enough that Ethan felt it more than heard it. Milo turned toward the sound. I'm not startled, not confused, but focused. Hannah lowered the volume. Milo followed the change with his ears. She raised it slightly. His eyes sharpened. That is not ordinary sensitivity. She murmured. He has been conditioned to respond to tone patterns. Ethan felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the rain. Like a working dog, Hannah did not answer right away. She parted the thick fur beneath Milo's neck, searching slowly, then stopped. Her finger still. Ethan, she said quietly. Come here. Beneath the damp silver coat was a line so fine he would have missed it in daylight. A tiny healed seam just under the collar line, hidden where the fur grew thickest. Hannah trimmed only enough hair to see clearly, then cleaned the spot with careful strokes. Milo did not flinch. He watched Ethan instead, as if the officer's reaction mattered more than the touch of the instruments. This was not an injury, Hannah said. This was placed from a locked drawer. She took a small, sterile kit and worked with the delicacy of a jeweler opening a watch. After a few silent minutes, she lifted out a metal capsule no longer than a grain of rice, darkened with age, but sealed tight. Ethan did not speak. The rain spoke for him, sliding down the glass in long, trembling lines. Hannah set the capsule in a tray, dried it, and opened it with a pair of fine forceps. Inside was a strip of oil paper, rolled so tightly it looked like a forgotten seed. She unfolded it beneath the lamp. The handwriting was faded but readable. Each letter pressed hard into the paper, as if written by someone in a hurry, but determined not to be misunderstood. If he comes back, tell Walker I kept my promise. Hannah's face lost color. Ethan stared at the words, and for a moment the clinic seemed to tilt beneath his boots. Walker, not a common enough name in a town like Ashford Hollow to feel harmless. Not when the puppy had been found at St. Elian. Not when the badge in his pocket had come from the same darkness. He swallowed once. Hard, who wrote that Hannah looked toward the back hallway, where old framed photographs hung beside thank you cards from families and farmers. One photograph showed her as a younger veterinarian standing beside an elderly man with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a German shepherd with noble eyes. I think, she said slowly, it was Samuel Price. Ethan knew the name, though he had not heard it spoken in years. Samuel had once been the county's most trusted animal doctor, the man who cared for search dogs, therapy dogs, and the old police canine unit before the program disappeared quietly into budget cuts and bad memories. Then, one winter, Samuel closed his clinic and left town without explanation. Some said he moved west. Some said grief had taken the last of his strength. Hannah kept staring at the note as if it had reached from the past and touched her hand. Samuel trained dogs to carry messages when radios failed, she said. But hiding one inside a puppy means he was afraid someone would search everything else. Ethan removed the evidence pouch and laid the muddy badge on the steel counter. Hannah leaned closer, under the clinic light. One part of the engraving finally showed through the rust. Saint Elian Division. Her breath caught. Milo stepped forward on the towel and placed one tiny paw beside the badge. Not on it. Beside it. As if guarding a grave marker. Ethan's voice came out lower than he intended. Why did you tell me not to set it down anywhere public? Hannah looked at him then. And the steadiness he had always known in her eyes was still there. But now it carried fear, sharpened by recognition, because your father was the last officer assigned to St. Wong's, Elian before it burned, she said. And because if Samuel Price hid this message inside that puppy, he was not trying to solve a mystery. She reached for the clinic phone with one hand and kept the other near Milo. Gentle and protective. He was trying to bring one home. Hannah's call to the station did not sound urgent in the way Ethan expected. She did not raise her voice. She did not rush her words. She simply asked for Chief Alan Mercer, gave her name, and said there was evidence connected to St. Juan, alien that needed to be handled quietly and immediately. That was all. Yet the silence that followed on the other end of the line seemed to pass through the room like a cold draft. Ethan watched her listening, watched the color remain gone from her face, watched Milo sit perfectly still beside the rusted badge as if the little dog understood the weight of names adults were afraid to say. When Hannah hung up, the clinic felt smaller than before. The rain had softened outside, thinning into a silver mist against the windows. But the storm inside Ethan's chest had only begun to gather. He is coming, Hannah said. Chief Mercer, Ethan asked. She nodded, and he said not to run the badge through regular evidence intake yet. Ethan's jaw tightened. That sounds like the kind of sentence that makes a man ask why. Hannah looked at the old service badge on the counter, then at the note under the lamp. Because some records do not disappear by accident. Ethan had spent most of his adult life respecting procedure. He trusted chain of custody. Signature. Sealed bags. Careful language in reports. Those things kept truth from becoming rumor. But standing in the warm light of the clinic with a puppy carrying a message under his skin, he felt the old certainty bend. His father's name lived in the back of his mind, like a room with the door shut. Thomas Walker had been Ashford Hollow's most respected officer once. The sort of man strangers waved to from porches and children trusted without being told. Ethan remembered large hands, smelling faintly of saddle soap. A winter coat hung by the kitchen door. A laugh that filled the house without trying. Then came the fire at St. Elian Rail Yard 18 years ago. And every memory after that seemed to carry smoke around its edges. The official report had called it a tragic accident during an after-hours inspection. A faulty heater, old wiring, a building too far gone to save. People brought casseroles, flags lowered. The town moved on with the practiced kindness of places that do not know what else to do. Ethan had joined the military not long after, partly out of duty, partly because leaving was easier than asking questions no one wanted to hear. Hannah folded the strip of oil paper beneath a clear evidence sleeve and sealed it with careful hands. Samuel Price worked with your father, she said. Not officially. At least not in the records. Most people saw. But my mentor kept old files. He believed animals remembered patterns humans overlooked. Your father believed him. Ethan looked down at Milo. The puppy had begun to tremble again. But not from cold. His ears were lifted toward the west wall of the clinic, toward the direction of the rail yard, as if some distant sound had found him through 3 miles of wet fields and sleeping streets. "Why would Samuel leave town?" Ethan asked. Hannah's eyes moved to the faded photograph in the hallway. "He told me once that loyalty could become dangerous when the wrong people feared it." I thought he was talking about dogs. A pair of headlights swept across the clinic windows before Ethan could answer. Gravel crackled outside. Chief Alan Mercer's county truck rolled to a stop under the awning, its blue emergency lights off, its engine idling low. Mercer was in his late 60s, white-haired, broad-faced, and careful in every movement. A man who had known Ethan since he was a boy and had attended Thomas Walker's funeral in a black suit that never quite fit. When he entered the clinic, he removed his hat slowly, rain shining on the shoulders of his coat. His eyes went first to Ethan, then to Hannah, then to the puppy on the table. For a moment, the old chief did not speak. Milo stepped forward, small paws soundless on the towel, and gave 3 soft barks. Mercer's expression changed in a way Ethan had never seen before. Not surprise, recognition. The chief crossed the room and leaned close to the badge without touching it. Under the lamp, the last hidden line of engraving showed through the mud. Thomas E. Walker. The name seemed to take all the air from the clinic. Ethan heard Hannah inhale softly beside him. He heard rainwater dripping from Mercer's coat onto the floor. He heard Milo's tiny breath. Quick but steady, Chief Mercer closed his eyes for 1 second. And when he opened them, they were wet with something older than grief. "Ethan," he said quietly, "your father did not go to St. Father Elian that night because of faulty wiring." Ethan could not move. The room, the rain, the badge, the note, the puppy, all of it narrowed to the sound of the chief's voice. Mercer looked toward the dark windows, toward the old rail yard, beyond the sleeping town. He went because someone asked him to protect a dog named Mercy. Mercer's words settled over the clinic with the quiet weight of snow on a roof. And for several seconds nobody moved. Ethan stared at the old chief, waiting for the sentence to change shape, waiting for some ordinary explanation to step in and make the night smaller again. But nothing came, only the soft hum of the examination light, the ticking of the wall clock, and Milo's tiny breath against the folded towel. Mercy was a German shepherd, Mercer said at last, his voice rough around the edges. One of the best tracking dogs this county ever had. Samuel Price trained her. Your father worked with her during the old St. Elian investigations. Ethan looked at the puppy, at the silver-gray coat, at the amber eyes too solemn for such a young animal. Milo did not blink. He watched Mercer as if weighing whether the old man had finally earned the right to speak. Hannah moved closer to the table, one hand resting near Milo without touching him. "What investigations?" she asked. Mercer took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief. Though they were not dirty, missing property, altered shipping records, evidence that came and went through that rail yard and never reached the courthouse. Nothing dramatic on paper, just enough wrong numbers to make honest people nervous. He put the glasses back on and looked at Ethan. "Your father believed St. Elian was being used to hide things that could hurt a lot of families if they stayed buried." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had spent 18 years imagining his father's last night as a tragic mistake. A good man in the wrong building at the wrong time. Now the past stood in front of him. No longer smoke, but a door. "Why did nobody tell me?" he asked. Mercer's face folded with regret. Because you were 24, angry, and already leaving for basic training. Because the people who knew were scared. Because some of us told ourselves silence was protection. The answer was honest enough to hurt. Milo suddenly turned toward the clinic door. His ears lifted high. A low sound, barely more than breath, rose in his chest. Not a growl. Abul. Hannah followed his gaze. He wants to go back. Absolutely not. Mercer said at once, though even he sounded unsure. That rail yard is fenced, unstable, and scheduled for demolition. Milo barked 3 times. Small, but sharp. Each bark landing in the room like a pebble dropped into still water. Then he stepped down from the towel, surprisingly steady now, and nosed the evidence pouch in Ethan's hand. The old badge shifted inside the plastic. Ethan understood before he wanted to. He is not asking. Ethan said softly. He is leading. Mercer rubbed a hand over his tired face. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the clinic windows silvered with mist. The world beyond the porch light looked newly washed, as though the storm had cleared a path and was waiting to see who would take it. Hannah wrapped Milo in a dry blue blanket, but the puppy squirmed until his front paws were free. Ethan carried him to the cruiser while Mercer followed in his truck. The 2 vehicles moving west through the sleeping county, without sirens, their headlights cutting long white tunnels through the fog. The road back to Ashford Hollow seemed different now. Mailboxes leaned out of the mist. Pastures glistened under the moon. The old Baptist church stood pale and still at the bend, its steeple pointing toward a sky slowly opening behind the clouds. Ethan drove with both hands on the wheel, the badge sealed on the console, Milo upright beside it like a tiny sentry. Each time they passed a side road, the puppy's nose twitched, but he did not react. Only when the black outline of St. Elian rail yard appeared beyond the chain-link fence did Milo rise on trembling legs and press both paws against the window. The abandoned loading house crouched in the distance, its roofline broken, its brick walls dark with rain. Yellow demolition notices fluttered on the gate. Ethan parked where he had found the puppy less than an hour earlier. The storm drain still gurgled softly beside the road, but Milo ignored it now. The moment Ethan opened the cruiser door, the puppy slipped from his arms, landed in a puddle, and trotted straight toward the locked gate. Milo, Ethan called, but the dog did not slow. He squeezed through a gap under the fence as if he had done it before, then stopped on the other side and looked back. Mercer unlocked the gate with a county key. He claimed not to remember keeping so. The hinges groaned open, and the sound rolled across the empty tracks like a warning from another decade. They followed Milo past weeds, rusted rails, and puddles that reflected the broken windows above. The puppy did not wander. He moved with purpose, nose low, ears forward, crossing the yard toward the oldest building on the property, the red brick freight office, where ivy had swallowed half the wall. At the base of that wall, Milo stopped. He raised one paw and scratched 3 times at the wet brick. Ethan lifted his flashlight. Beneath the ivy, faded but still visible, I was a small painted symbol, a dog carrying a key in its mouth. Hannah whispered, "Samuel." Milo sat beneath the symbol, rainwater shining on his fur, and looked up at Ethan with eyes that seemed far older than the body holding them. Somewhere inside the wall, a hollow tap answered the wind, slow and patient, as if the rail yard itself had been waiting for the little dog to come home. The symbol of the dog carrying a key looked almost childish beneath the beam of Ethan's flashlight. But no child had painted it there. The lines were too deliberate, hidden beneath years of ivy and soot, placed low enough for a dog to find, and high enough for a man to question. Mercer stood beside Ethan, with one hand on the brick, his palm moving slowly over the damp surface. "This wall was rebuilt after the fire," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "I remember the county report saying the freight office was sealed for safety." Hannah knelt near Milo, who had lowered his nose to the ground and was sniffing along the base of the wall with fierce concentration. The puppy paused at a narrow seam where the mortar looked darker than the rest, then tapped it once with his paw. A faint sound answered from behind the bricks. Not an echo, exactly, but a hollow breath. The kind old buildings sometimes give when the night air moves through forgotten spaces. Ethan felt the past pressing close around them. The freight office smelled of wet stone, iron, and weeds crushed underfoot. Moonlight slid through broken windows and fell across the tracks in pale bars. Far away, a church bell marked 3 in the morning, each note drifting over Ashford Hollow, as if the whole town were asleep under a thin blanket of secrets. Mercer radioed for 2 trusted deputies and a county maintenance crew, keeping his words plain and careful. Possible sealed room, old evidence, St. Elian property, no public traffic. While they waited, Milo sat beneath the painted symbol without moving, the blue blanket slipping from his shoulders. Ethan tried to lift him, but the puppy resisted gently, placing one paw against the brick again. "He wants it opened," Hannah said. Ethan looked at the tiny animal, at the mud still drying along its legs, at the amber eyes fixed not on the people, but on the wall. "Then we open it," he said. The crew arrived with portable lights, bright bars, and a quiet respect that made the scene feel less like an investigation and more like the opening of a long-locked room in a family home. No one joked. No one spoke louder than necessary. Brick by brick. They worked along the seam Milo had marked. The first pieces came free with a scrape of old mortar. Behind them was not solid fill, but a narrow pocket of darkness. Cool air slipped out, carrying the dry smell of paper, dust, and cedar oil preserved beyond time. Ethan's flashlight entered first. The beam found wooden shelves, metal boxes, and a small desk covered by a canvas tarp. The hidden room was no larger than a walk-in pantry, but everything inside had been arranged with care. It had not been abandoned in panic. It had been protected. Mercer stepped back, as if the sight had struck him somewhere deep. Hannah covered her mouth with one hand. Milo gave one soft whine and walked through the opening the moment it was wide enough, his little paws leaving wet prints across the dusty floor. He went straight to the desk, sat down, and looked at Ethan. Inside, the air was so still that Ethan could hear his own watch ticking. On the shelves were file boxes labeled by year, a reel-to-reel tape recorder wrapped in cloth, sealed envelopes, and stacks of shipping logs tied with faded string. Against the back wall hung an old police jacket inside a clear garment bag. The fabric, dark blue, the shoulder patch still visible beneath a veil of dust. Ethan did not need to read the name stitched over the pocket. He knew. His hand rose slowly, stopped short of touching it, and fell to his side. For 18 years, he had carried his father as a photograph, a foldflay, a story with the last page missing. Now that missing page hung in front of him, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. Hannah moved carefully near the lower shelf and lifted a worn leather collar from a shallow wooden box. A brass tag caught the light. Mertze. Milo stepped toward it, lowered his head, and pressed his nose to the name. Then, with the tenderness of something too small to understand grief and too wise to ignore it, he lay down beside the collar and rested his chin on the edge of the box. The room grew quiet enough for everyone to hear the wind outside pass through the weeds along the tracks. Mercer opened one of the envelopes with gloved hands. Inside was a photograph. Yellowed but clear, Thomas Walker stood in front of the freight office. Younger than Ethan, remembered him. One arm resting beside Samuel Price, who wore wire-rimmed glasses and a tired smile. Between them sat a full-grown German shepherd with noble ears and bright eyes. Mertze. Behind them, half hidden by shadow, was the same painted symbol on the wall, a dog carrying a key. Ethan stared at his father's face in the photograph and felt something inside him loosen. Not enough to heal, but enough to breathe. He knew this place existed. Ethan said. Mercer nodded slowly, and Samuel made sure it waited. Hannah found a small metal case beneath the desk, locked, but labeled in careful handwriting. For Ethan Walker, when the dog comes home. Milo lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's name, and the old tape recorder on the shelf clicked softly as its loose reel shifted in the night air. As if the room itself had finally decided it was time to speak, the small metal case felt heavier than it looked at, as if years had settled into its hinges. Ethan held it with both gloved hands while the others stood in the hidden room around him, their portable lights throwing long shadows over shelves that had waited in silence for nearly 2 decades. The label on top had not faded much. For Ethan Walker, when the dog comes home. The words seemed impossible, and yet there they were, written in Samuel Price's careful hand, each letter steady, each stroke carrying the patience of a man who had believed time could be trusted. Hannah found the key taped beneath Mercy's old collar, wrapped in wax paper so thin it nearly vanished between her fingers. She passed it to Ethan without speaking. Milo watched from beside the wooden box, ears forward, chin lifted now, as if some part of him understood that the room had only opened the first door. Ethan slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Inside the case was a bundle of letters, a small stack of photographs, and a cassette tape marked with one sentence. Mercy knew the way. Mercer brought the old tape recorder down from the shelf and set it on the desk. The machine looked fragile, all dust and dull metal. But when Hannah cleaned the contacts and Mercer found a working outlet through the maintenance crew's portable battery, the reels began to turn with a low, trembling hum. At first there was only static. Milo stood up. His little body grew still, every part of him listening. Then an old man's voice filled the hidden room, thin with age, but clear enough to reach every heart standing there. My name is Samuel Price. If this recording is being played, then Mercy's line has found its way back to St. Elian. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The voice continued. Samuel spoke of Thomas Walker, not as a name in a report, but as a friend. He said Thomas had discovered that certain freight records were being changed before they reached the courthouse, and that ordinary families had lost savings, land claims, and proof of ownership because papers disappeared in the rail yard before anyone could ask why. It was not a story of violence, Samuel said. It was a story of quiet theft, quiet fear, and quiet people being told they had misunderstood their own lives. Thomas had wanted the truth handled lawfully, carefully, without panic. Mercy had been trained to track document satchels by scent, to find hidden compartments, to recognize the tone pattern of Thomas's whistle and Samuel's old field radio. On the recording, Samuel paused, and in that pause the room seemed to hear the breathing of every year that had passed, the night everything changed. Samuel said, "Thomas gave me his badge and Mercy's collar. He told me that if the records vanished, the dog would still remember where the proof had been hidden." Mercer looked down, his face lined with shame and sorrow. Ethan did not look at him. He could not. The tape crackled. Then Samuel's voice softened. "I left town because Mercy was expecting pups, and because I believed one honest witness was safer if no one knew she had a future." Hannah lowered her hand to Milo's back. The puppy leaned into her touch but kept his eyes on the recorder. Samuel explained that Mercy lived quietly on a farm outside Burlington, protected under another name, and that over the years her bloodline carried the same strange gift, an ability to respond to low radio tones, to scent old leather and oil paper, to return again and again to hidden doors. Most of the pups became therapy dogs for veterans, gentle companions for people who needed a reason to wake up. But Milo was different. Milo followed Mercy's collar from the day his eyes opened. He slept beside it. He cried when it was locked away. He walked to the old crate where Samuel kept Thomas Walker's badge and would not leave it. "So I taught him the path," Samuel said, not because he was strong, but because he was faithful. Ethan felt tears gather but did not wipe them away. In the wavering light, he saw his father in the photograph, young and steady, one hand resting above Mercy's head, unaware that a promise made beside an old freight office would outlive him. The tape neared its end. Samuel's voice grew weaker. "But Kinder, Ethan, your father did not leave you with a mystery to hurt you. He left a truth that needed the right time, the right hands, and the right dog. Mercy kept her promise. I kept mine as long as I could. Now this little one has brought it home." The recorder clicked off. No one spoke. Outside the wall, the rail yard lay under pale moonlight. No longer only abandoned. No longer only broken. Ethan knelt slowly in front of Milo. The puppy stepped forward and placed one small paw on Ethan's boot, exactly as if he had been trained for that moment, and born for it too. Ethan touched Mercy's collar, then the badge, then the soft fur between Milo's ears. For the first time in 18 years, his father's story did not end in smoke. It ended with loyalty finding its way through the dark. The letters inside Samuel Price's metal case were wrapped with a faded blue ribbon and smelled faintly of cedar, paper dust, and the kind of years no one can hurry. Ethan did not open them all at once. Something in him understood that truth, when it has waited that long, deserves gentleness. He sat on an overturned wooden crate in the hidden room, while the others worked quietly around him, photographing evidence, labeling boxes, and lifting old records into clean containers beneath the soft glare of portable lights. Milo curled beside his boot, no longer trembling, his small body finally giving in to the exhaustion of a mission too large for a puppy. Every few minutes, though, his ears twitched toward Mercy's collar, as if even in sleep he was listening to a voice older than his own. The first letter was addressed not to the police, not to the court, but to Ethan himself. Samuel had written it less than a month before he passed. In a careful, wavering hand that grew lighter toward the bottom of each page, he wrote that he had watched Ethan from a distance over the years, not in a way meant to intrude, but with the quiet concern of a man who owed a debt to a friend. He had seen newspaper clippings about Ethan joining the army, then returning home, then taking a county badge of his own. He wrote that Thomas Walker would have been proud, not because Ethan followed him into service, but because Ethan kept helping people even after life had given him reasons to stop. Ethan read that line twice, then a third time, outside the freight office. Dawn had begun to thin the darkness. The sky over Ashford Hollow turned from black to slate, and then to the soft gray blue that comes before sunrise in Vermont. Mist hung low over the tracks. The weeds shone with rain. What had looked abandoned by night now looked tired, almost relieved, like a place that had finally told the truth it had been holding in its walls. Hannah stepped into the room with 2 paper cups of coffee from Mercer's truck thermos and handed one to Ethan without speaking. Her eyes were red from the cold air and from something kinder than cold. "There is more," Ethan said quietly. She sat beside him on another crate. He unfolded the last letter, the one marked with a small paw print in black ink. Samuel wrote that Milo had been born during a snowstorm in a barn outside Burlington. The smallest of 5. Too quiet at first, too watchful later, while the other puppies chased balls and wrestled in straw. Milo crawled again and again to the wooden box where Mercy's collar was kept. Samuel tried moving the box to a shelf. Milo cried beneath it, until Samuel took it down. He tried locking it in a cabinet. Milo sat in front of the door for hours, patient as a church candle. That was when Samuel began to believe the little dog was not merely attached to a scent. He was following a promise. In the letter, Samuel admitted he had been afraid to send Milo away. The world was loud, and Milo was small, but age had made Samuel honest. He knew the rail yard would soon be demolished, and if the hidden room vanished, Thomas Walker's name might remain forever trapped inside an unfinished story. So he placed the capsule beneath Milo's skin with the help of a trusted veterinarian in another county, packed the old badge in the crate, and arranged for Milo to be brought near Ashford Hollow by a farmer who owed him a favor. But Milo had slipped away before morning, carrying the badge himself to the storm drain beside St. Elian, as though he knew no one else could choose the final step for him. Ethan lowered the letter and looked at the sleeping puppy. He was not lost. He whispered. Hannah shook her head, her voice soft. No, he was sent. Across the room, Mercer opened another file box and found the missing land claims, insurance papers, shipping receipts, and signed statements that had once belonged to ordinary families in Ashford Hollow and the neighboring counties. Nothing about them was loud. No single page looked powerful on its own, but together they formed a map of wrongs quietly done and carefully hidden. And now, at last, carefully returned. Mercer held one folder against his chest for a moment and bowed his head. Thomas was right, he said. Ethan did not answer. He stood, walked to the back wall, and lifted his father's jacket from the garment bag with both hands. The fabric was stiff with age, but whole. The name Walker rested over the pocket, plain and steady. For years, Ethan had imagined grief as something that lived only in the past. Now he understood it could change shape. It could become gratitude. It could become breath. It could become a small silver-gray puppy asleep beside an old collar, having carried home a truth too heavy for any man to carry alone. By the time the sun rose over Ashford Hollow, the old St. Elian rail yard no longer looked abandoned. County trucks lined the gravel lane, their amber lights turning slowly in the morning mist, and deputies moved in careful silence from the freight office to the waiting evidence vans. No one rushed. No one shouted. The place had waited 18 years to speak. And even the men carrying boxes seemed to understand that some truths should be handled like fragile glass. Ethan stood near the open gate, with his father's jacket folded over one arm and Milo asleep inside his coat. The puppy's silver-gray head tucked beneath his chin. The little dog had done all he had come to do. And now, with the first sunlight warming the rusted rails, he slept as peacefully as if he had never known a storm drain. A hidden capsule, or the weight of a promise older than his life. Chief Mercer walked over just as the church bell downtown rang 7 times. His eyes were tired, but something in his face had changed. The old burden was still there. Yet, it no longer stood alone. The state investigators are on their way, he said. The records Samuel saved are enough to reopen everything. Some families are going to get answers they stopped hoping for. Ethan looked toward the freight office, where Hannah was kneeling beside Mercy's collar, placing it gently into a padded evidence box. And my father Mercer removed his hat. His name will be cleared officially. But Ethan, for what it is worth, some of us should have said what we knew long before paper made it safe. Ethan watched the mist lift from the tracks in pale ribbons. For years, he had imagined that hearing the truth would fill him with anger. Instead, what came was quieter and heavier sorrow, gratitude, and the strange relief of finally being able to lay a question down. Then say it now, he said. Mercer nodded, his voice barely above the wind. Thomas Walker was an honest man. Ethan closed his eyes. 4 words. 18 years late. Still. They reached him. Weeks passed, and Ashford Hollow changed in small, steady ways. The demolition of St. Amatory. Alien was stopped. Part of the rail yard was preserved, not as a shrine to sadness, but as a place of service. The old freight office became the Mercy Walker Center, a training space for search dogs, therapy dogs, and veterans learning how to trust quiet again. Families came with folders and photographs. Some received land records. Some received apologies. Some simply stood in the doorway of the hidden room and cried because history had finally remembered them. Ethan adopted Milo before anyone could ask whether he planned to. The paperwork was signed at Hannah's clinic on a clear Friday afternoon, while Milo chewed the corner of a rubber toy shaped like a mail truck. Hannah laughed for the first time in days, and Ethan found himself smiling without trying. That evening, he drove home to Maple Ridge Road with Milo in the passenger seat. No longer wrapped in an emergency blanket, but in a soft blue one Hannah had sent with him. The house felt different when they entered. Not warmer exactly, but less empty. Ethan hung his father's photograph above the mantel, beside the old military watch and a small framed copy of Samuel's final letter. Then he placed Mercy's replica collar on the shelf below, where the morning light could touch it. Milo padded through every room, sniffing corners, inspecting chair legs, then finally curling at the foot of Ethan's bed as if he had belonged there from the beginning. Near midnight, Ethan woke out of habit, reaching for the lamp before the old darkness could settle in. But the room was peaceful. Moonlight rested on the floorboards. Milo lifted his head, gave one sleepy wag of his tail, and placed a tiny paw on Ethan's boot beside the bed. Ethan let his hand fall gently over the puppy's back. Outside, the wind moved through the maples with a sound almost like breathing. For the first time in many years, Ethan did not feel the past standing at the door. He felt it resting. Finally, where it belonged. Some promises travel farther than we understand, carried by loyal hearts quiet hands, and the smallest creatures God sends to lead us home.